Your brain is not weak, it's not broken, and it's not failing you. It's doing exactly what it was trained to do. The problem is not that you can't focus. The problem is that your brain has learned that distraction is more valuable than attention. And learning, once repeated enough times, becomes automatic. Distraction doesn't arrive as chaos, it arrives as choice, a small pull toward novelty, a quick escape from effort, a harmless check, a brief scroll, a moment of relief. Each one feels insignificant, but your brain is always learning from repetition, not intention. And what it has learned is this: stimulation is safer than stillness, novelty is more rewarding than depth, and interruption is normal. The modern world didn't steal your attention. It trained it slowly, efficiently, and constantly. Every notification, every feed, every rapid shift of stimulus taught your brain to expect change, to crave movement, to abandon depth before it becomes uncomfortable. Focus began to feel heavy not because it is unnatural, but because it became rare. And whatever the brain rarely practices, it begins to resist. This is why effort now feels harder than it should, why silence feels uncomfortable, why boredom feels intolerable. Your brain has been conditioned to treat uninterrupted attention as a threat to relief. When stimulation is always available, stillness feels like deprivation. The absence of input is interpreted as loss, and so the mind reaches outward again and again, not out of weakness, but out of training. Understanding this changes everything because it reframes distraction as a biological adaptation, not a personal failure. Attention is not something you summon with willpower. It is something your brain allocates based on what it has learned is valuable. And the good news is this: what the brain learned, it can unlearn, but not through motivation, not through disciplines as force, and not through guilt. It happens through redesigning the conditions your attention lives in and retraining your brain to find safety and reward in depth again. Distraction is not a flaw that randomly appears in the mind. It is a learned behavior shaped by repetition, reinforcement, and environment. The brain is constantly adapting to patterns in its surroundings, updating its expectations based on what consistently brings relief, stimulation, or reward. When distraction repeatedly provides a small burst of novelty or an escape from effort, the brain registers it as valuable. Over time, this value assignment becomes automatic. The urge to shift attention no longer feels like a decision, it feels like an impulse. That impulse is not evidence of weakness, but of learning. The brain evolved to prioritize information that signals change. In unpredictable environments, novelty often meant opportunity or threat. Paying attention to new stimuli increased survival. This bias toward novelty is deeply wired in modern environments. However, novelty is abundant and constant. Screens, notifications, and endless streams of information provide rapid shifts in stimulus with minimal cost. Each shift activates reward circuitry, reinforcing the act of disengaging from the current task. The brain learns that attention does not need to be sustained to be rewarded. It learns that interruption is normal and beneficial. This learning happens through exposure, not intention. You do not consciously decide to weaken your focus. The brain simply updates its predictions based on experience. If every moment of boredom is resolved by stimulation, boredom becomes intolerable. If every moment of difficulty is interrupted by distraction, difficulty becomes something to escape. The brain does not distinguish between productive relief and unproductive relief. It only recognizes that attention shifted and discomfort decreased. That reduction in discomfort becomes the signal that teaches the brain what to repeat. Over time, this creates a specific attentional pattern. The brain becomes optimized for scanning rather than sustaining. It learns to quickly assess whether something is immediately rewarding and to disengage if it is not. This pattern is efficient in environments saturated with information, but it is incompatible with deep work, learning, and long-term thinking. Focus begins to feel effortful not because the brain lacks capacity, but because it has been trained away from using that capacity. Neural pathways that support sustained attention weaken through disuse, while those that support rapid switching strengthen. This process is reinforced socially and culturally. Modern norms reward responsiveness and availability. Being reachable, quick to reply, and constantly updated is treated as competence. The brain absorbs these signals. Attention becomes fragmented not only by technology, but by expectation. Each interruption carries social meaning, reinforcing the idea that sustained focus is less valuable than constant engagement. The brain learns that being interrupted is normal and that interrupting oneself is acceptable. Over time, the boundary between external interruption and internal impulse disappears. Distraction also feels safe. Focus requires staying with uncertainty, effort, and delayed reward. Distraction offers immediate relief. The brain, designed to conserve energy and reduce perceived threat, naturally gravitates toward the option that feels safer in the short term. When distraction is consistently available, the brain learns that it does not need to tolerate discomfort to survive or succeed. This learning shifts the threshold of tolerance. What once felt manageable now feels demanding. The brain has not lost strength, It has recalibrated its expectations. Importantly, distraction is not just about attention. It is about regulation. When attention shifts away from difficulty, emotional arousal drops, the nervous system relaxes. That relaxation is reinforcing. Over time, the brain learns to use distraction as a regulatory tool. Instead of processing discomfort, it escapes it. This makes distraction feel necessary rather than optional. The impulse to check, switch, or scroll is often a response to subtle stress, not curiosity. The brain has learned that relief is one click away. The learned nature of distraction explains why attempts to fight it with willpower often fail. Willpower is episodic and limited. Learning is structural and persistent. A brain trained for distraction will continue to generate impulses to disengage, even when consciously committed to focus. This creates frustration and self-blame. People interpret the struggle as a character flaw rather than a training history. But the brain is not resisting change, it is expressing what it has learned works. Understanding distraction as learned behavior also reveals why environment matters more than intention. The brain responds to what is consistently available, not to what is occasionally desired. If distractions are always present, the brain will continue to prioritize them. Attention follows reward. To change attention, the reward structure must change. This is why reducing exposure to distraction is more effective than trying to ignore it. The brain cannot learn a new pattern if the old one is constantly reinforced. The most important implication is that learning can be reversed. Neural plasticity does not disappear with age. The same mechanisms that train distraction can retrain focus. When attention is sustained despite discomfort and no immediate relief is provided, the brain receives new information. It learns that staying is possible. It learns that discomfort does not require escape. Over time, this updates predictions. The impulse to disengage weakens. Focus becomes less effortful, not because tasks become easier, but because the brain has relearned how to allocate attention. This reframing removes moral judgment from the conversation. You are not addicted to distraction because you lack discipline. You are distracted because your brain adapted to an environment that rewards fragmentation. That adaptation can be redirected, but it requires understanding that attention is trained through experience, not commanded through desire. The brain learns what you repeatedly allow, and whatever you repeatedly allow eventually becomes automatic. Dopamine does not motivate progress, it motivates pursuit. It is a chemical signal that tells the brain something is worth paying attention to again. When people say they lack motivation, what they are often describing is a mismatch between what their brain has learned to pursue and what they want to pursue consciously. In modern environments, dopamine has been repeatedly paired with novelty, speed, and interruption rather than depth, effort, or completion. This pairing did not happen by accident. It happened because novelty delivers fast, reliable dopamine signals, while progress delivers slower, uncertain ones. The brain adapts to whichever pattern is reinforced most often. Originally, dopamine evolved to support behaviors that improve survival over time. Hunting, problem solving, learning skills, and navigating social hierarchies all required sustained effort and delayed reward. Dopamine spikes were tied to progress toward these goals, not to their instant fulfillment. This kept organisms engaged through uncertainty and difficulty. In that context, dopamine reinforced persistence. It helped the brain stay invested in long-term outcomes even when immediate payoff was absent. Modern systems have rewired this relationship. Digital environments, constant information streams, and algorithmic design provide rapid dopamine release for minimal effort. Each new piece of content, each notification, each unexpected stimulus delivers a small prediction error that the brain interprets as valuable. Importantly, these dopamine spikes are disconnected from meaningful progress. They do not signal movement toward a goal, they signal novelty itself. Over time, the brain learns that switching attention is more rewarding than staying with one thing. This is what dopamine hijacking looks like. The brain's pursuit system becomes oriented toward change rather than completion. Attention shifts become the behavior that dopamine reinforces. The longer something stays the same, the less rewarding it feels. Depth loses its appeal because it does not provide frequent novelty signals. The brain begins to crave interruption, not because it is distracted, but because interruption has become the primary source of dopamine. This shift has profound effects on how effort feels. Progress-oriented tasks usually involve a period of low stimulation before reward. Writing, studying, building, training, and thinking deeply all require staying engaged without constant feedback. When dopamine is conditioned to expect frequent spikes, these tasks feel unrewarding in the short term. The brain interprets the absence of novelty as a lack of value. Motivation drops not because the task is meaningless, but because the dopamine system is no longer aligned with it. The result is a state where novelty feels exciting and progress feels heavy. This is often misinterpreted as laziness or lack of ambition. In reality, it is a learning issue. The brain has learned that stimulation is a reliable reward and that effort is not. It is not refusing to work. it is following its training. Each time attention shifts to something new and a dopamine spike follows, the association is strengthened. Each time effort is abandoned because it feels dull, the association between effort and low reward is reinforced. Dopamine hijacking also distorts time perception. Novelty compresses time by filling it with frequent stimuli, while sustained effort stretches time by reducing stimulation. This makes focused work feel longer and more draining than it objectively is. The brain becomes impatient not because time is scarce, but because reward is infrequent. This impatience further pushes behavior toward novelty, creating a loop where distraction feels increasingly compelling and focus feels increasingly costly. Another consequence is the erosion of intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation arises when the brain finds value in the process itself, not just the outcome. This requires a stable reward signal associated with engagement. When dopamine is dominated by novelty, intrinsic motivation weakens. The brain stops finding satisfaction in sustained activity because the reward system has been recalibrated to expect constant change. People begin to rely on external pressure or urgency to act, mistaking adrenaline for motivation. This hijacking is intensified by unpredictability. Dopamine responds most strongly to rewards that are uncertain. Variable schedules of reward, like those found in feeds and notifications, produce stronger dopamine responses than predictable ones. This makes distraction especially sticky. The brain learns that checking might produce something interesting, and that possibility is enough to trigger pursuit. Progress-oriented tasks, by contrast, are often predictable and incremental. They do not offer the same uncertainty-driven spikes, making them less competitive in the brain's reward economy. Importantly, dopamine hijacking does not eliminate the capacity for deep motivation, it masks it. The underlying circuitry for effort and persistence remains intact, but it is underutilized. When the brain is constantly fed high-frequency novelty, it has no reason to invest in slower reward pathways. This creates the illusion that motivation has disappeared. In reality, it has been redirected toward behaviors that provide faster feedback. Reversing this process requires changing what dopamine is paired with. The brain does not respond to explanations, it responds to experience. When novelty is reduced and effort is sustained long enough for reward to occur, dopamine begins to reattach to progress. This does not happen instantly. Initially, effort feels flat because the brain is used to faster signals. But with repetition, the reward system adapts. Dopamine begins to fire in anticipation of effort rather than escape from it. This is why short bursts of motivation rarely solve the problem. Motivation spikes often come from novelty themselves, a new idea, a new goal, a new surge of inspiration. These spikes fade quickly because they do not retrain the system. They add more novelty without changing the underlying associations. Sustainable motivation emerges when the brain relearns that effort reliably leads to reward, even if that reward is delayed. Understanding dopamine hijacking reframes the struggle with distraction and motivation. The issue is not self-control versus weakness. It is what the brain has been taught to value. A brain trained on novelty will pursue novelty. A brain retrained on progress will pursue depth. The direction of motivation follows the direction of dopamine, and dopamine follows the patterns of reward you consistently allow, not the goals you occasionally desire. Attention is not an infinite resource that can be summoned on demand. It is a biological capacity shaped by energy, neural limits, and training history. The brain allocates attention the way a body allocates oxygen under exertion. It prioritizes what seems most valuable, most urgent, or most rewarding based on learned signals. When people say they should be able to focus if they try harder, they are assuming attention operates like a moral choice. In reality, attention is governed by systems that evolved to manage scarcity. It is finite, sensitive to depletion, and responsive to environment. From an evolutionary perspective, attention functioned as a survival filter. The brain could not process everything at once, so it learned to select. Selection was guided by threat, opportunity, and novelty. This selectivity conserved energy and reduced error. Paying attention to the wrong thing at the wrong time had costs. As a result, attention became tightly regulated. It is metabolically expensive to sustain, requiring coordinated activity across multiple brain networks. Prolonged focus consumes glucose, oxygen, and neurotransmitters. When resources decline, the brain naturally seeks relief through shifting or disengaging. Modern life places unprecedented demands on this system. Instead of periods of focus followed by recovery, attention is fragmented continuously. Each interruption forces the brain to reorient, reevaluate, and reallocate resources. This switching carries a cost. Cognitive energy is lost during transitions, even when they seem brief. Over time, frequent switching drains attentional reserves faster than sustained focus would. The brain responds by shortening attention spans, not out of laziness, but out of energy management. This is why attention fatigue feels different from physical tiredness. The body may feel capable, but the mind resists engagement. The resistance is not psychological reluctance, it is physiological signaling. The brain is conserving resources by avoiding sustained demand. When attention is treated as unlimited, this signal is misinterpreted as lack of motivation. In reality, it is a boundary. Attention has been overdrawn. The finite nature of attention also explains why multitasking is illusory. The brain cannot attend to multiple demanding tasks simultaneously. It switches rapidly between them, paying the cost each time. This creates the subjective feeling of productivity while reducing actual output. More importantly, it accelerates attentional depletion. The brain spends energy on switching rather than progress. Over time, this trains the brain to expect constant change and to resist staying with any single demand. Attention is also regulated by emotional and physiological state. Stress, uncertainty, and unresolved emotion consume attentional bandwidth. When the nervous system is activated, attention is pulled toward monitoring rather than execution. This made sense in ancestral environments where vigilance was necessary. In modern contexts, chronic low-grade stress keeps attention partially occupied, reducing capacity for deep work. The individual may feel distracted, but the brain is actually busy managing perceived threat. Another constraint on attention is predictability. Sustained attention is easier when conditions are stable. Frequent changes in input force the brain to reassess priorities. Digital environments are designed to maximize change. Feeds update, notifications interrupt, content shifts rapidly. Each change competes for attentional allocation. The brain, sensitive to novelty, reallocates resources repeatedly. This leaves less capacity for tasks that require continuity. Attention is not lost, it is divided and diluted. Importantly, attention is trained by what it is repeatedly asked to do. When the environment demands short bursts of engagement, attention adapts by becoming brief and reactive. When the environment supports sustained engagement, attention adapts by becoming stable and resilient. This is not a personality difference. It is plasticity. The brain strengthens the circuits it uses most. If attention is rarely held on one thing, the neural support for holding weakens. This training effect is often misunderstood as preference. People say they prefer quick tasks or cannot focus for long, but preference follows capacity. The brain prefers what it can do efficiently. When sustained attention is undertrained, it feels effortful and unrewarding. The brain avoids it not because it dislikes depth, but because depth exceeds current capacity. This avoidance further reduces training, creating a downward spiral. The finiteness of attention also means recovery matters. Attention replenishes through rest, stillness, and reduced stimulation. However, modern rest is often stimulating. Passive consumption does not restore attention, it consumes it differently. True recovery involves allowing the attentional system to idle without input. Silence, boredom, and unstructured time allow resources to replenish. When recovery is replaced with stimulation, attention never fully resets. The baseline capacity declines. Understanding attention as finite reframes productivity. The goal is not to push harder, but to allocate wisely. Protecting attention becomes a strategic decision, not a moral one. Reducing unnecessary demands preserves capacity for what matters. Designing environments that minimize interruption supports sustained engagement. These are structural changes, not mindset shifts. This perspective also reduces self-blame. Difficulty focusing does not indicate a flawed character. It indicates an overloaded system. When attention is treated as a resource to be managed rather than a trait to be judged, behavior changes. People become more deliberate about inputs, transitions, and recovery. Attention improves not because of effort alone, but because conditions support its use. The most important implication is that attention cannot be rebuilt through motivation. Motivation consumes attention, it does not create it. Attention is rebuilt through constraint, stability, and practice. Limiting inputs reduces competition. Extending engagement gradually increases capacity. Allowing recovery restores reserves. Over time, the system adapts. What once felt impossible becomes manageable, not through force, but through alignment with biological limits. When attention is respected as finite, choices become clearer. Not everything deserves focus. Not every stimulus merits response. Each allocation has a cost. The brain is always paying that cost, whether consciously or not. Taking attention back begins with recognizing its limits and designing life in a way that honors them rather than constantly exceeding them. Modern environments do not merely distract attention, they actively train fragmentation. The brain adapts to what it repeatedly experiences, and today's environments are structured around interruption, speed, and constant input. Attention is pulled in multiple directions not because individuals fail to resist, but because the environment continuously signals that shifting focus is normal, necessary, and rewarded. Over time, the brain internalizes these signals. Fragmentation becomes the default mode of operation, not as a conscious choice, but as an adaptation to persistent conditions. In earlier contexts, the environment imposed natural limits on stimulation. Information arrived slowly, tasks unfolded sequentially. Interruptions were infrequent and often meaningful. Attention could remain anchored because there were fewer competing demands. In contrast, modern environments are engineered to maximize engagement by maximizing change. Feeds update endlessly, notifications arrive unpredictably, and content is optimized to capture attention instantly. Each of these features teaches the brain that attention should be flexible, reactive, and ready to move at any moment. This training occurs through repetition. Each time attention is interrupted and successfully redirected, the brain learns that switching is valuable. The reward is not always pleasure. Sometimes it is relief from boredom, effort, or uncertainty. That relief is enough. The brain does not ask whether the switch improved long-term outcomes. It only registers that a change occurred and that something was gained or discomfort was reduced. Over time, this learning strengthens neural pathways that support rapid disengagement and weakens those that support sustained engagement. Fragmentation also becomes socially reinforced. Responsiveness is equated with competence. Being reachable at all times is treated as responsible behavior. Delayed responses are often interpreted as neglect or inefficiency. These social norms further train the brain to keep attention open and reactive. Even in the absence of external interruptions, internal monitoring persists. The mind remains partially oriented toward potential incoming demands, preventing full immersion in any single activity. The architecture of modern tools amplifies this effect. Many platforms are designed around variable reward schedules, which are particularly effective at training behavior. The brain learns that checking may produce something interesting, important, or gratifying. This uncertainty keeps attention on standby, ready to switch. Over time, the threshold for interruption lowers. Even minor cues are enough to pull attention away. The brain becomes hyper-responsive to signals of change, treating them as priorities regardless of actual importance. Fragmentation is further reinforced by the way tasks are structured. Multitasking is normalized and often expected. People juggle messages, documents, meetings, and media simultaneously. Each switch carries a cognitive cost, but the environment rarely allows recovery. Instead of returning to baseline, attention is pushed into another demand. This continuous partial engagement exhausts attentional resources while preventing the deep processing that leads to satisfaction and completion. The brain adapts by reducing commitment to any single task. Over time, this training reshapes perception. Sustained focus begins to feel unnatural. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Silence feels empty. The absence of stimulation is interpreted as something missing rather than as space to engage. This perception is not innate, it is learned. The brain has been conditioned to expect constant input. When input drops, the system signals discomfort, prompting a search for stimulation. Fragmentation thus perpetuates itself. The environment creates the conditions, and the brain responds by seeking the very stimuli that reinforce those conditions. The impact of this training extends beyond productivity. Fragmented attention reduces the depth of experience. Activities are sampled rather than inhabited. Emotions are felt briefly before being interrupted. Thoughts are initiated but rarely completed. This shallow engagement can create a sense of restlessness or dissatisfaction that is difficult to name. People may feel busy yet unfulfilled, stimulated yet bored. The brain receives constant input but little resolution. Fragmentation prevents closure, and without closure, the nervous system remains unsettled. Importantly, fragmentation is not evenly distributed across contexts. Environments that minimize interruption allow attention to stabilize. When interruptions are reduced, the brain initially resists. Discomfort arises because the system has been trained to expect change. But with time, resistance fades, attention settles. This reveals that fragmentation is not a fixed trait, but a state induced by environmental conditions. Change the conditions, and the brain adapts again. Modern environments also reduce the need for internal regulation. External cues dictate when to shift attention. This outsourcing weakens self-directed control. The brain becomes less practiced at deciding what deserves focus. Instead, it responds to whatever is most salient. Over time, this erodes the sense of agency over attention. People feel pulled rather than choosing. This loss of agency is often mistaken for lack of discipline, but it is a consequence of repeated external control. Understanding that environments train fragmentation reframes the solution. The goal is not to fight distraction internally, but to redesign external conditions. Reducing the number of cues reduces the need for constant regulation. Creating uninterrupted periods allows attention to stretch. Establishing predictable rhythms reduces the brain's need to monitor for change. These adjustments shift the training signals the brain receives. Fragmentation is unlearned when the environment no longer rewards it. This perspective also clarifies why short-term fixes often fail. Turning off notifications for an hour does little if the rest of the day reinforces interruption. The brain responds to overall patterns, not isolated interventions. Consistency matters. When environments consistently support focus, the brain reallocates resources accordingly. Over time, sustained attention becomes easier and more natural because it aligns with what the brain has been trained to expect. The most important insight is that attention problems are not individual defects occurring in isolation. They are collective adaptations to shared conditions. Modern environments systematically reward fragmentation, and the brain responds predictably. Taking attention back requires acknowledging this reality and choosing to create pockets of resistance where continuity is protected. In those spaces, attention can recover, deepen, and reassert itself as the default mode rather than the exception. Attention can be rebuilt, but not by trying harder or wanting it more. The brain does not respond to motivation the way people expect it to. Motivation is volatile and short lived, and it draws from the same limited attentional resources it is meant to support. When attention is already fragmented, relying on motivation only adds pressure to a depleted system. What actually restores attention is constraint. When options are reduced, when inputs are limited, and when the environment no longer demands constant switching, the brain begins to reallocate resources towards sustained engagement. The brain is highly sensitive to structure. It learns what is expected based on what is consistently allowed. When distractions are always available, the brain keeps attention in a flexible, reactive state. When distractions are removed, even temporarily, the brain initially reacts with discomfort. This discomfort is often misinterpreted as failure. In reality, it is withdrawal from constant stimulation. The brain is recalibrating its expectations. If the constraint remains, the discomfort fades and attention stabilizes. The nervous system learns that it does not need to stay on alert. Deliberate constraints work because they reduce cognitive load. Every choice consumes attention. Deciding whether to check something, whether to switch tasks, whether to respond immediately, all require mental energy. When these choices are removed in advance, attention is preserved for the task at hand. This is why systems outperform motivation. Systems remove decisions. They create default behaviors that the brain can follow without constant regulation. Attention thrives under these conditions because it is not being repeatedly taxed by choice. Time boundaries are one form of constraint. When the brain knows that attention will only be required for a defined period, resistance decreases. Open-ended demands feel threatening because the brain anticipates indefinite effort. Clear start and end points make sustained attention tolerable. This is not about tricking the brain, but about aligning with how it processes demand. Predictability reduces stress. Reduced stress frees attention. Spatial constraints also matter. Attention is context dependent. The brain associates environments with behaviors. When the same space is used for stimulation and focus, attention remains divided. Creating environments with a single purpose simplifies allocation. In spaces designed for focus, the brain gradually learns that sustained attention is expected. Over time, entering that space triggers a different attentional mode automatically without conscious effort. Another powerful constraint is limiting input velocity. When information arrives slowly, attention has time to settle. When information arrives rapidly, attention remains shallow. Slowing input retrains the brain to tolerate continuity. This might mean reading instead of scrolling, listening instead of switching, or allowing silence instead of filling it. Initially, this feels uncomfortable because the brain expects stimulation. With repetition, the discomfort subsides and depth becomes rewarding again. Attention is also rebuilt through progressive exposure. Just as muscles adapt to gradually increased load, attention adapts to gradually increased duration. Expecting immediate, sustained focus after long periods of fragmentation is unrealistic. The brain needs time to rebuild capacity. Short periods of uninterrupted attention provide training signals. As these periods become consistent, duration can increase. Each successful exposure teaches the brain that staying is possible and safe. Importantly, rebuilding attention requires protecting recovery. Attention replenishes when the brain is allowed to idle. This means periods without stimulation, not passive consumption. Silence, low sensory environments, and unstructured time allow attentional resources to restore. When recovery is replaced with more input, attention never fully resets. The brain remains in a semi-engaged state, unable to accumulate the reserves needed for depth. Emotional regulation plays a role as well. Discomfort often drives distraction. When the brain learns that discomfort does not need to be escaped immediately, attention becomes more stable. This learning occurs through experience, not instruction. Staying with mild discomfort without resolving it teaches the nervous system that engagement is tolerable. Over time, the urge to flee decreases. Attention is no longer hijacked by the need for relief. Rebuilding attention also changes identity indirectly. When sustained focus becomes part of daily experience, self-perception shifts. People begin to see themselves as capable of depth. This reduces internal resistance. Attention no longer feels like something that must be forced. It becomes aligned with identity. This alignment further stabilizes behavior because the brain prefers consistency between action and self-concept. The key is that attention responds to what is repeatedly practiced, not what is occasionally intended. Systems that consistently constrain distraction and support continuity retrain the brain at a structural level. Over time, attention reallocates naturally. Focus becomes less effortful because the environment no longer demands fragmentation. Motivation becomes less necessary because the conditions support engagement. Taking attention back is not about reclaiming something lost. It is about rebuilding something that adapted away under different conditions. The brain remains capable of depth, patience, and sustained engagement. It simply requires the right signals. Constraint provides those signals. Consistency reinforces them. And with time, attention reemerges not as a struggle, but as a natural response to an environment that finally allows it to do what it was always designed to do. Distraction did not steal your attention, it trained it. And what has been trained can be retrained. The struggle you feel is not a personal failure, and it is not proof that focus is gone forever. It is evidence that your brain adapted efficiently to the conditions it was placed in. It learned to survive in a world of constant input by becoming flexible, reactive, and alert to change. That adaptation made sense. But it no longer serves the future you're trying to build. Taking your attention back does not require more willpower or better motivation. It requires changing what your brain is exposed to, what it is allowed to practice, and what it is rewarded for sustaining. Attention returns when the environment stops demanding fragmentation, when interruptions are reduced, when choices are simplified, when depth is protected long enough for the brain to remember what engagement feels like. Focus is not something you force in moments of discipline. It is something that emerges when conditions support it, when silence is no longer treated as emptiness, when boredom is no longer treated as a threat, when effort is no longer something to escape. In those conditions, attention stabilizes naturally because the brain no longer needs to scan for relief. The most important shift is this: you stop asking why you can't focus and start asking what is training your brain to fragment. You stop blaming yourself and start redesigning your surroundings. You recognize that every small choice either reinforces distraction or rebuilds depth. There's no dramatic turning point, only a quiet accumulation of evidence that staying is possible. Your brain is not addicted to distraction because it is broken, it is responsive. And when you begin feeding it continuity instead of interruption, restraint instead of novelty, and structure instead of chaos, it will respond just as efficiently. Attention will return, not as a struggle, but as a baseline. And when it does, progress stops feeling heavy, depth stops feeling foreign, and the future becomes something you can finally stay present long enough to build.